This is going to be a break from my normal thing to talk about Project BB. Some of you might remember me mentioning it in one of my older videos, but today I want to talk a little more about it. Consider this a devlog of sorts. So what is Project BB? Well, picture a kitchen sink. Now throw in Azur Lane, Warhammer 40k Tabletop, and Magic the Gathering. Now look in the sink. That's Project BB. But to be more specific, this is a 1v1 or 2v2 deck building game with dice roll combat themed around World War I and II warships. Oh, so it is a physical game, but we are working on a digital version as well. I know most of you are gamers, so if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments, because our plan is to do most of our alpha testing through the digital game. And today we're going to be talking about the base layer of the game, which is the combat. But before we go into that, I want to give a high-level perspective of what the game is so we don't get lost in the source. And to do this, I want to draw your attention to the Battle of Midway, in particular, Nagumo's Dilemma. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then I highly recommend this video by Montemayor, as it does an amazing job of framing it. But it basically boils down to this. Nagumo, aboard Akagi, had already launched a strike on Midway, and this strike force was returning when the American fleet was detected by a spotter plane. Nagumo had to make the painstaking decision of whether to strike with his reserve planes, leaving Akagi defenseless, or wait for the strike force to return, but risk giving the unknown US force the opportunity to strike first. And this decision had to be made within the space of 50 minutes, and you also have to bear in mind that Midway's airbase was still operational. Many perceive this to be the decision that sealed the outcome of the war, as we all know that the US forces came out on top in hindsight. So once you start delving into World War II warship history, you're going to start seeing some common themes, namely that reconnaissance was so shit on either side. If I had $1 for every time a spotter completely misidentified a vessel or was tens of kilometers from where they were supposed to be, I'd have like $200. The next is that logistics wins wars, and every nation had a philosophy that permeated everything they did, all the way down to how they planned to put out fires. So at its core, Project BB is about managing resources and trying to cut off your opponent's supplies. Second, you can have the best fleet and be crushing your opponent, but it means nothing if you cannot find your opponent, or you get unlucky with weather conditions in the next round, or your commander just gets straight up sniped out of the bridge, like the Japanese did to the Russians in World War I. That can happen, by the way. So while there are ways to get intel, there will always be the dilemma of not completely knowing what your opponent will do until the clash at sea. Last, but definitely not least, can Bismarck just straight up snap a battleship in half on the first volley? Absolutely. Can the USS Johnston charge at the Yamato and come out unscathed? You bet. Are Akagi and Kaga going to have ludicrous first strike potential? You better believe it. But it goes a little further than that too. If you want to try out Kentai Kaisen, you know, the Japanese doctrine of the decisive battle, you can do that. If you want to use mass submarine wolfpack tactics, that's an option. If you want to simply outbuild your opponent and subject your opponents to trade embargoes, those are all scenarios that can and have already played out in Project BB. But anyways, I'm not trying to build up hype as much as I'm trying to just point out that we're looking at a small part of a much bigger picture. Also, please excuse the AI art. This is just for prototyping. I have no intention of finalizing the game in this state. It's just so I can work with the nuts and bolts. Okay, so let's get started. Combat is conducted between you and your opponent's fleet. Each fleet can consist with up to 6 cards, or vessels if you will, and damage is determined by dice roll and then allocated at the end of each round. What does this mean? Well, say I go first and I target your destroyer with my cruiser and I roll really hot and I just outright demolish your destroyer. Well, when it's your turn, your destroyer will target and fire its weapons as if nothing happened, but after firing, the destroyer will sink and it will be out of play. So even though you are taking turns, you can think of it as both of your actions are taking place at the same time. A single battle between two fleets consists of 5 rounds: first contact, battle round 1 to 3, and then aftermath. We're not going to worry about first contact and aftermath too much, but basically submarines only really do stuff in first contact or aftermath, and everything else happens in the battle rounds. Okay, so to have a look at how this all works, we'll have a look at a destroyer and we'll go over the stats. So at the top left, we have the whole classification, and this card has a blue frame indicating that it is just a standard no frills destroyer. Top right, we have the hull points or hit points, if you will. So destroyers have 3 health. And then below that, we can see that the armor class is 3+. That simply means that if anything hits the destroyer, they need to roll a 3 or higher on a d6 for damage to be applied. In the stat block, we have FP, which is firepower, 1d6/1 dash. And the way we read this is that when you attack with your guns, you roll 1d6 die. If you hit and penetrate the armor, the damage will be 1. The dash indicates that this gun does not have armor penetration abilities, but that's okay because next up we have TRP, which is torpedoes, which is exactly the same as the FP stat, except we have a -2 for the armor penetration. So let's say we fired the torpedo at a vessel that had an armor class of 4+. 4 minus 2 means that we would only need to roll a 2 or higher for the damage to be applied. Just don't roll ones. Simple. Now I mentioned that you have to hit your targets before you do your damage rolls, and that's where the hit stat comes in. So a destroyer has a hit stat of 5/4/4+. The numbers refer to the battle rounds from left to right. So on battle round 1, you will hit on a 5+. On battle round 2, you will hit on a 4+. On battle round 3, you will also hit on a 4+. Hit is done in this way to simulate that your fleets are traveling towards each other, and things are just easier to hit when they're closer. That's how we get around using models and measuring tapes, etc. SP is your speed. All vessels are either fast, medium, or slow. Think of this as a keyword for which abilities are triggered. For example, submarines can only target slow vessels in first contact. Your AA stat is for anti-air. This is specifically only used when carriers attack this vessel. 1d6, 4+. So when a carrier attacks, you roll 1d6. If you roll a 4 or more, then that carrier needs to remove a die from their attack because you shot down their plane. AVI is the attack stat that is specific to carriers. So 3 kinds of attacks, each has their strengths and weaknesses. Below the stat block is where we have abilities. This is a basic destroyer, so it will have the destroyer rule. So the first part is basically the reason why you want destroyers. They hunt submarines, and when a destroyer hunts a submarine, it can't fire and everyone in your fleet can see it. However, if your destroyer sinks during the battle, then the submarine that was being hunted can activate in aftermath. So the humble destroyer is pretty important for keeping your cargo ships safe. Now the last part of the ability is pretty simple. +1 to hit for TRP attacks. This represents the destroyer's superior ability to maneuver and, actually face its target. So that changes things because now the hit stat for your guns is 5/4/4+, but your torpedoes are modified to 4/3/3+. Okay, so let's talk about some dice rolling fundamentals here. Rolling a 1 always fails, and rolling a 6 always succeeds. And this means that dice rolls can never be modified to requiring something like a 7+ or anything like that. Also, modifiers for dice rolls can never move a stat more than 1 unit. So let's say that this destroyer gets some crazy buff that gives +1 to your hit stat. So now your torpedoes should be hitting at +2 because you have this buff and the destroyer ability. But in Project BB, it will still only modify to +1. The destroyer will never hit anything on a 2+. Now that makes it sound like there isn't any point in stacking buffs, but there still is because it counteracts debuffs. For example, let's say that the battle is taking place at nighttime and everyone suffers a -1 to their hit stat. So your torpedoes have a +1 from the destroyer ability and a -1 from being in a night action. So the result would be that your hit stat doesn't change at all. But add that buff back on, and now we have a +2 versus a -1, so you can compete for that -1 or +1 modifier by stacking buffs and debuffs. So let's put it all together. Let's say that we have 2 destroyers and they want to attack these 2 enemy cargo vessels or hull classification AK. Your turn within the battle round takes the following steps. Select a target for each vessel in your fleet that can activate. All weapons will fire at that one target, so you can't choose to fire your torpedoes at one target and then your guns at another. Furthermore, let's say that the target you selected sank before the vessel fired. That's it. Those shots are wasted. This also has some consequences for different attack types. For example, submarines normally cannot be targeted by FP or AVI attacks, so you would just fire your torpedo and the other weapons would do nothing. Anyways, after selecting targets, we go through each vessel. First, we roll to see if we hit the target, and for each target that hits, we then make a damage roll to see if the attack penetrated the armor. So in this scenario, it is battle round 1, and each destroyer is going to target a different cargo vessel because I'm just gonna roll hot. Let's do our first one. I'm going to roll for my guns first. So on battle round 1, I need a 5+, and lucky me, I rolled a 6. We have a hit. So now we can look at the cargo vessel and their armor class is 3+. I don't have armor penetration, so I need a 3 or higher. And I roll a 4. Okay, so our FP stat says 1 damage and cargo vessels have 2 hull points, so we're halfway there. Now I'm going to fire my torpedo, but remember that destroyers are +1 to hit with torpedoes, and we are in battle round 1, so we need a 4+. And I rolled a 2. Unlucky. Because I didn't focus fire, this cargo ship is going to survive the battle round because I cannot change targets. On our second destroyer, the guns, I roll a 3. That's no good. Onto the torpedo with the +1. And I roll a 5. Okay, at least that's something. So we're going to roll our damage. Now, torpedoes really shred. They have a -2 armor penetration, so technically this cargo ship's armor would go from a 3+ to a 1+. I can't fail. Except we have to remember that rolling a 1 always fails, and rolling a 6 always succeeds. So we have to get a 2 or higher. And I get a 2, so no problem. The second cargo ship takes 1 damage, and now you know how basic combat works in Project BB, and the importance of focus fire. This will also help you in Warhammer 40k, by the way. And thus concludes our basic combat tutorial. Depending on how this goes, we'll see if there's any interest in it. If you guys like it, then we'll look at basic hulls for building your fleet and how they interact with each other next. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.